Hi, I'm Vincent Laforet at Canon Explorer of Light. In this series, I'm going to discuss tilt-shift lenses with you. Canon makes 4 of these, a 17mm, in this case here a 24mm, as well as a 45mm and a 90mm lens. There's traditional ways to use this, either with the shift function, where you can actually shift the lens up or down or left or right, and that actually allows you to minimize distortion, especially with wide-angle lenses, very commonly used in architecture photography or videography, as well as portraits. We also have the tilt function, which can do many things with focus in terms of keeping different elements in focus on different planes. And also it's a very creative use that you might know as the miniature effect. This is what I've used on several assignments to make the world, especially from an elevated angle, look like a miniature. We're going to go ahead and show you a few examples of how to use these lenses over the next 3 series. Let's get started. So I wanted to show you a few features with these tilt-shift lenses so you're familiar with every function that they come with. So you can go ahead and tilt it up or down, or shift it up or down. On the other side of the lens, let me go ahead and turn the camera around. So these 2 dials here will actually allow you to lock either the tilt or the shift, have different degrees of friction. So here is the shift up or down. Go ahead and lock it. And there's actually a lock button over here that allows you to tilt it up or down. At any point you go ahead and tighten that right there to lock it in place. So here we're going to show you the rotation button. It allows you to rotate the shift function in either a horizontal mode or vertical, or pretty much actually anywhere in between, which is really nice. And here's the lever here that allows you to rotate the tilt function. Again, either in horizontal or vertical or anywhere in between. As you notice, you can actually rotate these independent of one another, which is a really special feature with these lenses. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a typical example. Here we are underneath the Brooklyn Bridge with the East River in the foreground. Another thing I wanted to mention too is we're having an Atomos Ninja recorder up here, and it's actually recording live feed out of the 5D Mark III. That allows us to see what we're shooting and my adjustments as we go. So we'll go ahead and hit record right over here. Like any wide-angle lens, if I want to tilt up, you'll notice how the entire city below gets distorted. It kind of pinches in, if you will, due to the wide-angle distortion. So I have to make a choice as to whether I keep the top of the bridge in or I tilt down and have no distortion and too much of the East River in the frame with not enough of the Brooklyn Bridge. The beauty of tilt-shift lenses, you can actually shift them to get the best of both worlds. The first thing I'm going to do is compose my frame very carefully to make sure I'm dead center of the frame on the back of my camera, and making sure that the plane is perfectly horizontal as well. Now that I've got that composed well, that means I've eliminated any wide-angle distortion. I'm going to go ahead over here and shift the lens up or down. And you'll see that that allows me now to pick whether or not I cut the bottom of the frame right at the bottom of the city. And you can see how much of the Brooklyn Bridge I can now see with no distortion whatsoever. Or I can fine-tune it and shift it down a little bit more. And I can also, of course, go in the opposite direction and include quite a bit of the water if that's something I wanted to do. But for our purposes, we're going to go ahead and frame this up right here in the rule of thirds, maybe a little higher, and catch that ferry as it passes behind us. Hi, I'm Vincent Laforet, Canon Explorer of Light. We're going to continue discussing tilt-shift lenses, in this case, the shift function of these lenses. Here's a perfect example of when you would use such a function. You see the UN building right behind us on the east side of Manhattan. Very vertical, very rectilinear building. If you go ahead and you take a wide-angle lens, in this case a 17mm lens, we're going to go ahead and engage live view, you'll see that we're faced with a conundrum of sorts. As long as we're square on, we can get no distortion in the building. But if you want to get the top of the building with a regular lens, as we tilt up, there's a tremendous amount of distortion that's going on, not only in the side buildings that they're falling or pinching in, but also in the building itself. This is where a shift function of the tilt-shift lens comes into effect. So our first step is going to be to try and center everything. And I'm looking at both buildings on the side. If I tilt up too much, the buildings will pinch in, and they'll pinch out if I tilt down too much. Gotta find the absolute right level. Right there looks pretty good. I'm gonna go ahead and punch in with our focus and double check that we're perfectly in focus on those windows. This is where I shift the lens up. And you'll see the lens actually physically moves up. And now you can see that even though the camera's not moving, I'm not tilting the camera up, I'm seeing the top of the building. And I can frame it exactly the way I wish. That looks good to me. So know that if you have to get a perfect architectural photo of an exterior of a building, this is the perfect lens, either a 17 or 24 or even a 45 to do that with. And you can eliminate all distortion. You can keep everything looking super rectilinear and look like the top architecture photographs you see in those magazines. So here we are at Grand Central Station. This is one of my favorite locations to shoot in Manhattan. We're actually in one of the 6 windows that are on the east and west side of the building, and we can get a really unique angle. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to shoot vertical with the 24mm tilt shift 3.5 version 2. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and push this back button back here and rotate the lens 90 degrees so that as we shift up or down in the same direction as the orientation of the vertical image. Go ahead and reframe again. And you'll see what we'd expect, which is a huge amount of distortion on the sides here, which is what you'd get with any wide-angle lens when it's pointed down this much. So here's the beauty of the tilt-shift lens. I'm going to go ahead again and point it perfectly towards the horizon. Make sure our alignment is dead on, so there's the minimum amount of distortion possible. Definitely useful to have those grid lines up there right now. There we go, lock everything up. You can see everything's centered. I've got 3 arches on the right, 3 arches on the left, and hopefully very little distortion. We're going to go ahead and the first thing I always do is I'm going to punch in with my live view and make sure I'm in focus. Here we go, right on the information sign right there. Go back to full frame and live view right now, and you'll see now I can go ahead and shift the lens down and still get the original frame you saw, almost, but pretty darn close, with almost no distortion on the columns. And we're going to go ahead and shoot a few frames. So we're here now in downtown Manhattan at the Breslin, one of New York's more famous steakhouses. It's got an absolutely beautiful setting, beautiful bar, beautiful details. And still, it's a pretty compact spot, so this is always a challenge for an architecture photograph, especially of an interior. It's a perfect use of a 17mm tilt shift. We're going to do something a little bit different here. We're actually going to shift the lens up and down and in fact stitch together a panoramic. This is going to allow us to get a very nice range in terms of the framing, a somewhat of a rectangular but more squarish image. We're also going to minimize distortion, and this is a great way to get a very unique looking image pretty quickly. I'm going to go ahead and frame up the bar and really look carefully at the vertical lines. I want to make sure that the camera is perfectly level and that there's no distortion whatsoever in the vertical columns. So I'm going to go for a longer exposure, low ISO, get a nice rich negative. And once I've done that, I'm going to check my focus, go ahead and punch in. You can see that everything's lined up geometrically. And the next step simply is to go ahead and start shifting. So I'm going to start from the bottom of the range. Not all the way to the bottom, I'm going to go 1 tick above because you might get a little bit of vignetting if you go all the way to the bottom, and fire off a frame. Once that's done, go ahead and come up to the next mark, fire off a frame again. These are going to overlap, that's the idea, because we're going to do this in software. 1 more frame without any shifting whatsoever. And then the last 2 frames, 1 more, and the last. I'd probably have to adopt an 11mm or even wider to get something similar if I want to do this with 1 lens, and you'd see a lot more distortion. That's the advantage of doing it this way. Go ahead and show you how these images stitch together. Here we are in Adobe Photoshop. We're using the auto import feature where we select these 5 frames and it's automatically going to stitch the images together. And you can see it does a really nice job of it. And you can see when you look at these images, there's a good lack of distortion that's pretty impressive. I'm going to show you 1 more example that we shot in downtown Manhattan. Again, this time we used the same 17mm tilt shift lens. I minimized as much of the distortion as I could on any of the buildings, and I went ahead and went from left to right in 4 or 5 frames. But it's a great way to stitch images together without any distortion whatsoever, without having to correct that in post with software. So one of my favorite uses for tilt shift lenses is using the tilt effect to create a miniature look. I've learned quite a few things over several years on how to make that work best. First of all, your location relative to the subject is really important. You kind of want to be elevated. I would say anywhere between 1 to 3, maybe 4 stories higher than your subject. Also, I would recommend you shoot a little wider than you think because you want a good sense of place. If you're shooting too tight, it doesn't really quite work as well for me. Try to shoot wide open or maybe one stop closed down so you get a good amount of depth of field, not too much. If you get too much of the field, if you're shooting at f8, f11, or f16, you're going to really minimize the effect and it's not going to work as well. And lastly, make sure you use the magnifying tool in live view. You'll find that the focus is really critical and you want to try and focus on a spot that's actually interesting. You want to lead the eye somewhere. Try to tell a story with this technique. Don't just do it for the sake of doing it. And that way, hopefully you'll get some good results. So we're going to go to a woman rink and see what we get and demonstrate how to do the tilt shift effect with the tilt shift lenses. So when I arrive on the scene, I'm going to go ahead and compose the frame just the way I'd want it to. I'm going to try and keep the buildings pretty rectilinear. I'm now going to go ahead and tilt up a little bit. And you'll see that as I do that, the composition changes ever so slightly. And I might want to make a small adjustment. In this case, I'm going to tilt it all the way up. I'm going to go ahead and lock the lens. And I'm going to go ahead and tilt the camera down just a little bit. There you go. Perfect. And now here comes the critical part. You got to pick a nice point that you want to keep in focus. I'm going to punch in. There we are at 10 times magnification. Remember, we're wide open on the lens. We've got almost no depth of field. And you've got to make a choice. Either you can stay with the little skaters there in the center of the frame, taking their lesson. You can see the coach right there. And that's going to be a nice subject of interest, especially in time lapse. Or you can pick the skaters in the foreground. You can see just how critical the focus is. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and pick the little skaters in the center because they're going to be kind of a continuous source of dependable motion. Go ahead and fire a frame off. And there you have it. In this case, I'm also going to connect a time-lapse trigger from Canon, the TC80N3, into the time-lapse port or the trigger port. And we're going to go ahead and fire a series of frames, 1 frame every second for about 5 or 10 minutes. And we can get a time-lapse of this shoot. And we can also shoot a little bit of video as well in the regular video mode on the 5D Mark III. This will work with HDSLRs as well as any motion camera, whether it's a C100, C300, C500, any motion camera with an EF lens mount will work with these tilt shift lenses just great. So here we are in Tudor City, looking up 42nd Street, looking west. I'm going to go ahead and use a 90mm tilt shift lens and use the tilt function vertically so I can actually make it look like a miniature effect, if you will. I'm going to focus on 2nd Avenue. I'm going to go ahead and tilt my lens up, recompose a little bit. I'm going to lower the camera slightly. There we go. Make sure that it's aligned dead center. Go ahead and punch in on my focus. I'm going to focus it right there on 2nd Avenue. You can see the traffic coming through. Punch in real carefully to make sure we're good. You can see it's very critical focus, especially with a 90mm lens. I'm going to pick the middle of the street in this case. I'm going to wait for cross traffic to be going north to south. All right, there's a good composition. I'm going to drag the shutter a little bit lower, get a little more exposure. Look at our histogram again. See, it's pretty healthy. It's spiking a little bit on the right. We're not really losing any detail. Could probably go a little more. Get a little more detail on the shadows without losing too much. And there we go. So here we have an example where we want to shoot 2 different subjects at 2 different distances with a long telephoto lens. In this case, it's a 90mm tilt shift lens, 2.8. And we want to focus on the clock as well as the Flatiron building. Normally you'd have to make a choice, either shoot on the foreground or on the background to keep them in focus. You could of course stop down and that would give you more depth of field, but it creates some technical challenges, especially if you're trying this in video. With the tilt shift lens, all you need to do is rotate the lens a few degrees, in this case 3 ticks, so that both the clock as well as the Flatiron buildings are in focus. It's a great tool to find a way to correct for the optical limitations and depth of field limitations of most lenses. What we have in this situation is a camera that is not parallel to the focal plane of your subject. This is an angled plane relative to the sensor. So normally you'd have to shoot with a lot of depth of field, let's say f16 or f22. Sometimes as well you don't have enough light to do that, specifically if you're shooting video. So here's where we pull off the shot. If you go ahead and frame up with a traditional 45, and basically you would pull focus from either the foreground bottle or all the way to the background bottle. This is a traditional problem with depth of field. If I simply go ahead and rotate just about 2 clicks, you'll see that everything is almost magically in focus all at once. So we have a beautiful model of Bhavani here, freezing her bottom off. It's what, 20 degrees out here. We're going to try to quickly get a nice shot that shows portraiture on a wide angle lens. In this case, a 17mm lens. I'm using both the shift function to minimize the distortion on the bridge, as well as a tilt function to have just her face in focus with parts of the bridge and the skyline in the background. So here's the frame right here. I'm going to double check and punch in to make sure that her face is totally in focus. It's a very critical focus. This is where live view really sings again. Here we go. So in this last example, we're going to use a 90mm tilt-shift lens. I don't really use this lens that often in terms of architecture or landscapes, but for portraiture I do use it quite a bit. It's a really nice creative effect, especially when you use a tilt function. You can actually keep a small part of the subject in focus, in this case just the eyes. We're going to go ahead and shoot this vertically for a nice headshot portrait of Bhavani. We're going to go ahead and compose her here, right with the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. I'm going to go ahead and tilt this up and down, and I see if I tilt up, for me the top is way too out of focus, so I'm going to go ahead and tilt down so that the top is a little more in focus and the bottom part of the frame really blooms up nicely. Go ahead and punch in right here with the live view and obtain really critical focus with the 10 times magnification. Make sure just the eyes are perfectly in focus. That's awesome. And go ahead and fire off a few frames. Here we go. Really nice. Okay, great.